Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight we're going to spend a long, quiet evening with a man that history decided almost unanimously to hate. There is no need to keep track of names. There is no need to remember dates. If you drift off somewhere in the middle of a siege or a betrayal, that is entirely the point. The story will keep going without you, the way stories always have. But before we get to him, let us ask a slower question, the kind of question that is better asked with the lights low. What actually makes a bad king? Is it losing territory? Because if that were the measure, we would have to be much harder on some very well-loved monarchs. The British Empire, that vast pink smear across the old classroom maps, essentially dissolved during the reign of Elizabeth II, and she died one of the most admired figures on the planet. Is it taxing your people into the ground? Charles I squeezed his subjects dry, largely so he could keep buying paintings, which is really just the medieval and early modern version of spending the national budget on expensive art nobody else was allowed to touch. Is it cruelty? Richard III is the man popular memory accuses of quietly disposing of his own nephews, and his brother reportedly drowned in a barrel of wine, which is either the strangest accident in English history or something far less accidental. And yet none of them own the title. When people reach for the phrase "the worst king England ever had," they almost always land on the same three letters. John, he is the only king in English history so thoroughly disgraced that no other English monarch has ever been willing to take his name. Not one. There have been 8 Henrys, 8 Edwards, 6 Georges, and precisely 1 John, and after him the name was quietly retired, like a jersey nobody wants hanging in the rafters. That is a remarkable thing to accomplish. It takes real commitment to be so bad that your name becomes radioactive for 800 years. So tonight we're going to ask the question properly, slowly, with all the time in the world. Was John really that bad? And if he was it because of who he was, or because of the impossible position he was born into? Let us go back further than John. Let us go back before England was really England at all. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was not a map of nations. That idea of borders drawn firmly around a people who all speak the same language and salute the same flag comes much later. What Europe had instead was a scattering of kingdoms built around cultures, loyalties and family, all of them overlapping and elbowing each other, rather like the seating arrangement in a very old, very violent school cafeteria. The Franks sat at the centre, loud and confident, the ones everyone else measured themselves against. The Byzantines were away in the east, wealthy and elegant and permanently convinced they were still Rome, which, to be fair, they were. The Anglo-Saxons were off in their damp northern corner, farming, feuding, and producing beautiful poetry about how cold and sad everything was. Italy was carved into fragments arguing about churches. The Moors held the south of Spain and, quietly, most of the good libraries. And the Visigoths, who had once been terrifying, had been ground down into history's footnotes. And then there were the Vikings. They arrived the way weather arrives. They came out of the north in shallow-drafted ships that could sail up rivers no proper navy could follow, and for 2 centuries they made the coastlines of Europe an anxious place to live. But here is the thing about Vikings that the helmets and the shouting tend to obscure. They did not only raid. They settled. They traded. They married in. They stayed. One of them was a man remembered as Rollo the Walker, so called because legend claims he was too large for any horse to carry. Around the year 911, after a great deal of unpleasantness along the Seine, the king of the Franks made a decision that would echo for 1,000 years. Instead of fighting these Northmen forever, he gave them land. Take this stretch of coast, he essentially said. Guard it. Stop burning my monasteries. Call it whatever you like. They called it Normandy, land of the Northmen. Within a few generations, something extraordinary had happened. Those raiders had become Frenchmen. They spoke French, they built stone castles, they endowed abbeys, they became devout and legalistic and obsessed with land rights. but they kept the appetite. The Normans of the 11th century were the most effective military aristocracy in Europe, and they were looking around for somewhere to put all that energy. Meanwhile, England was having its own difficult century, absorbing invasions from Sweyn Forkbeard and later his son Cut, who briefly ruled a North Sea empire spanning England, Denmark, and Norway, and whose name has caused schoolchildren difficulty ever since. And then Caen 66, the one date that even people who despise history remember. William, Duke of Normandy, looked across the Channel and had an idea. Not a subtle idea, not a complicated one. Simply this: what if the two sides of that water were joined, and I sat on top of both of them? He crossed with an invasion fleet, won a single decisive battle near Hastings, and by Christmas Day he was being crowned in Westminster Abbey. There is a small, dark, perfect story about that coronation. When the assembled crowd shouted their approval, as was the custom, William's Norman guards outside did not understand the language. They heard a roar from inside the abbey and assumed it was an assassination attempt. So they did what nervous armed men have always done. They began setting fire to the surrounding buildings and cutting down anyone nearby. The new king was crowned in a church slowly filling with smoke, while outside his own men killed the people who had just cheered for him. If you want a single image for the Norman conquest of England, that is not a bad one. But William, whatever else he was competent. Over the next 20 years he stitched the realm together. He replaced the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy almost wholesale with his own followers. He built castles at every point of tension. He ordered a survey of the entire kingdom, the Domesday Book, so precise that people said not one ox nor cow nor pig escaped it. And he founded a dynasty that, for a while, looked like it might run smoothly forever. It did not. When his son Henry I died in 1135, having lost his only legitimate son in a shipwreck, the succession collapsed into 19 years of a civil war between his daughter Matilda and his nephew Stephen. Contemporaries said that in those years Christ and his saints slept. History gave the period the finest name any civil war has ever received: the Anarchy. And it is out of that mess that our story's real engine appears. Matilda's son was named Henry, and Henry was not a patient young man. At the age of 14, with no money, no experience, and no permission from anyone who mattered, he hired a small company of mercenaries and invaded England to claim his mother's throne. It went exactly as well as you would expect. The campaign fizzled, the mercenaries wanted paying, and the teenage would-be conqueror found himself stranded and humiliated. Here is the part that tells you everything about the world these people lived in. Young Henry wrote for help, not to his mother, but to King Stephen, the man whose crown he had just tried to take. And Stephen paid his mercenaries and sent him home. Whether that was chivalry, contempt, or the calculation of a tired man who had been fighting for 2 decades, no one can say for certain. But a few years later, when Stephen's own son Eustace died suddenly, the exhausted king looked at this relentless young Angevin and made peace. "You will be my heir," he said. "Let this end." So Henry II came to the throne of England, and he had already collected an astonishing hand of cards. From his father he had Anjou, from his mother the claim to England and Normandy, and from a marriage that scandalised Europe he acquired the greatest prize of all. Eleanor of Aquitaine was, at that moment, the Queen of France, and she was extremely tired of being it. She had been married to Louis VII for 15 years. She had gone with him on crusade, ridden through Anatolia, and watched the whole miserable venture collapse. She had given him 2 daughters and no son, and in the brutal arithmetic of medieval kingship, that made the marriage a failure. So both parties reached for the reliable royal escape hatch, the one that had rescued unhappy dynasties for centuries. Consanguinity, a convenient examination of the family tree, revealed, to everyone's theatrical surprise, that the couple were third cousins once removed, and therefore the marriage had never been valid at all. The annulment came through, and within roughly 8 weeks, Eleanor, still one of the wealthiest landholders in Europe and now suddenly available, married Henry of Anjou, who was also her third cousin. This is worth pausing on, because it will matter later, again and again. European royal genealogy in this era is not a family tree. It is a braid. The same names, the same bloodlines, folding back into each other generation after generation, so that every war is also a family argument, and every treaty is also a seating chart for someone's wedding. By this marriage, Henry became lord of a territory stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Historians would later call it the Angevin Empire, though empire is a generous word for what it actually was. It was not a unified state. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies and counties, each with its own laws, its own customs, its own nobles, held together by nothing except the personal loyalty owed to one man. Remember that. It is the single most important fact in tonight's story. That inheritance was held together by a person, not a structure, which meant it would only ever be as strong as whoever happened to be holding it. And Henry and Eleanor, whatever their later difficulties, were extremely productive in the early years. 8 children. 4 sons who survived into adulthood, the youngest of them arriving in December of 1166, when the great inheritance had already been mentally divided among his older brothers, was named John. He was the 4th surviving son, and in the medieval world that is very close to being nobody at all. By the time John was born, his father had already sketched out how the great inheritance would be carved up, and there had been no reason to leave a slice for a child who did not yet exist. The eldest boy, another Henry, would have England, Normandy and Anjou, the heart of everything. Richard II would have Aquitaine, his mother's vast southern duchy. Geoffrey III would have Brittany through marriage. And John would have the affection of his parents, a good education, and the polite understanding that he was a spare part. The court even gave him a nickname for it, John Lackland. It was not at first an insult. It was simply an accurate description, the sort of thing a chancery clerk might write without malice. But nicknames have a way of settling into a person, and this one would follow him for the rest of his life, and then for 8 centuries after it. While his sons were still small, Henry II was busy doing the thing he was genuinely brilliant at, which was governing. It is easy to lose sight of this beneath all the family melodrama, but Henry II was one of the most consequential administrators England ever had. He inherited a kingdom that had spent 19 years tearing itself apart, and he set about making it work. He standardised the law so that it applied the same way in Yorkshire as it did in Kent, which is where the phrase common law comes from, law common to the whole realm, rather than varying with whichever lord happened to own the field you were standing in. He revived and expanded the use of juries, groups of local men sworn to give honest answers about disputes, which is the distant ancestor of every jury box in the English-speaking world. He sent out travelling judges on circuit, men with no local ties and therefore no local loyalties, so that justice would arrive from outside rather than being administered by the same neighbour you were arguing with. He also went after the barons. During the anarchy, hundreds of unlicensed castles had sprouted across England, private fortresses built by men who had taken advantage of the chaos. Henry pulled them down, often charging their owners for the privilege of losing them. He tightened royal authority over Scotland and Wales. He intervened in Ireland. And by combining all of that with his continental possessions, he became the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, more powerful in practical terms than the King of France, to whom in strict feudal theory he still owed homage for half his lands. That contradiction is going to haunt this entire story, so hold on to it. The King of England was also a vassal. On the continent he knelt. But there was one power in Europe that Henry could not simply out-administer, and that was the Church. The quarrel began over something that sounds technical and turned out to be lethal. If a man in holy orders committed a crime, murder, theft, anything, who tried him? The Church insisted on its own courts, which were notably gentler and could not impose a death sentence. Henry insisted that a crime committed in his kingdom belonged in his courts. He believed, not unreasonably, that a system where thousands of men were exempt from royal justice made a mockery of royal justice. To win the argument, Henry did something clever that turned out to be the worst decision of his reign. He appointed his closest friend, his chancellor, his drinking companion and hunting partner Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury. The theory was simple. Put my man in the church's highest office, and the church will finally see reason. What Henry had not accounted for was that Becket would take the job seriously. The moment the mitre was on his head, the worldly royal servant vanished and was replaced by an uncompromising defender of ecclesiastical privilege. He opposed his king at every turn. He excommunicated the king's supporters. He fled abroad, returned, and immediately resumed the fight. And then, at Christmas of 1170, in a bad temper in Normandy, Henry said something. The exact words are lost, and every version we have was written down by people with an interest in how it sounded. The famous one is a question. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? 4 knights heard it, or heard something like it, and they took ship for England. On the 29th of December they walked into Canterbury Cathedral during the evening office and killed the Archbishop on the steps of the altar. The horror of it went through Christendom like a shock through water. Within 3 years Becket was a saint. Canterbury was the greatest pilgrimage site in northern Europe, and Henry II, the most capable king of his generation, was the man who had murdered an archbishop in his own cathedral. Young John was about 4 years old. Meanwhile, his eldest brother was having a very particular kind of crisis. Henry the young king had been crowned during his father's lifetime, a French custom meant to secure the succession, which meant that England now had 2 anointed kings, one of whom had absolutely no power whatsoever. He had the title, the ceremonies, and the household. He had no revenue, no lands he actually controlled, and no authority his father did not immediately overrule. He was, in effect, a very expensive ornament, and he knew it. The tension broke over, of all things John. Henry II arranged a marriage for his youngest, then around 5 years old, to the daughter of the Count of Maurienne, and as part of the settlement he assigned the boy 3 castles in Poitou. It was a small gesture toward a small child. But those castles belonged to the young king's allotted inheritance, and to a young man already convinced he was being humiliated, it was proof that his father would never give up anything, ever, to anyone. So in 1173 the young king rebelled. And he did not rebel alone. Richard joined him. Geoffrey joined him. King Louis VII of France, Eleanor's former husband, cheerfully backed the whole enterprise. Rebellious barons on both sides of the Channel joined. The King of Scots joined. And Eleanor, Henry's own queen, joined too. This is the Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174, and on paper it should have destroyed Henry II. Nearly everyone who mattered was against him. What happened instead is one of the most remarkable performances of medieval kingship. Henry moved with terrifying speed, hiring mercenaries with money his administrative reforms had made available, striking in Normandy, then in Brittany, then crossing to England, then back again. He captured the King of Scots. He broke the rebel barons one by one. And he did public penance at Becket's tomb, walking the last stretch to Canterbury barefoot and submitting to be whipped by the assembled monks, which converted the greatest stain on his reputation into a display of humility so effective that the very next day news arrived of his victory in the north. God, it seemed, had forgiven him. He forgave his sons too. He gave them revenues, honours, and a great deal of paternal understanding. Rebellion by a son was, in this family, almost a rite of passage. His wife received different treatment. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had been captured attempting to flee to France dressed as a man, was placed in confinement in England, and she remained there for 16 years. And John? John was 6 years old and did not rebel, for the very good reason that 6-year-olds cannot. But it is around this point that chroniclers begin describing him as his father's favourite, which may be true, and may simply be a consequence of being the only son in the room who had not yet betrayed anyone. He was raised partly in the household of his eldest brother, partly at the great abbey of Fontevraud, and given an education unusually good for a prince. He read, He collected books. He had a sharp, quick, legalistic mind, genuinely interested in the details of administration and law, which in a different life might have made him a superb royal official. Then the family began to thin out. In 1183, the young king rebelled again, this time against both his father and his brother Richard, and in the middle of the campaign, having plundered a shrine to pay his troops, he contracted dysentery and died at the age of 28. Dysentery is going to appear more than once tonight. It killed more medieval soldiers than swords ever did. His death rearranged everything. Richard was now the heir to England, Normandy, and Anjou. And Henry II, reasoning quite sensibly, told Richard to hand Aquitaine down to John. Richard refused, flatly, absolutely, and with feeling. Aquitaine was his mother's land. He had spent a decade fighting to control it. He had bled for every castle in it, and he was not going to give it to his teenage brother because the family chessboard had shifted. So Henry, in a moment of parenting that explains a great deal about this dynasty, told John and Geoffrey they had his blessing to go and take it by force. They tried. It went catastrophically. Two younger brothers attempting to invade the personal fiefdom of the finest soldier in Europe achieved exactly what you would expect, which was a squalid little war of raids and burned villages that accomplished nothing except demonstrating that John was not yet a commander. His father decided he needed something else. Something smaller. Ireland Norman lords had been carving out holdings in Ireland for years, and Henry sent John over in 1185 with an army, money, and the intention of making him lord of the place. It was meant to be a training exercise in ruling. It was a disaster from the first day. The story that has come down to us, whether literally true or a chronicler's shorthand for a young man's contempt, is that when the Irish kings came to make their submissions, John and his companions laughed at them and pulled their long beards. Whatever the precise insult, the effect was real. Alliances that had taken years to build collapsed within months. Irish forces harried his troops. His money ran out. His mercenaries deserted. And after roughly 8 months, John sailed back to England having lost his army, spent his treasury, and turned a fragile peace into open hostility. He was 19, broke, and publicly humiliated. And he was still fourth in line. Then, in 1186, the family thinned again. Geoffrey, Duke of Brittany, the third brother, was in Paris. He had been spending a great deal of time there, cultivating a friendship with the young King of France that his father would have found deeply alarming if he had understood how far it had gone. And while he was there, he entered a tournament. Tournaments in the 12th century were not the tidy, roped-off jousting matches of later centuries. They were closer to mock battles fought across open countryside by dozens of armoured men on horseback with real weapons, real horses, and a real and constant chance of being trampled to death in a crush of bodies. Which, according to the most widely repeated account, is exactly what happened. Geoffrey went down under the hooves and did not get up. He was 27. King Philip of France was said to have been so distraught at the funeral that he had to be physically restrained from throwing himself into the grave, which tells you either a great deal about their friendship or a great deal about Philip's instinct for public theatre. Possibly both. Geoffrey left behind a widow, Constance of Brittany, who was pregnant. A few months later she gave birth to a son, and named him Arthur, a name freighted with the whole weight of Breton legend, and chosen very deliberately to say something about who the boy was and what he might one day be. Write that name down somewhere in the back of your mind. Arthur of Brittany. He is 400 words old, and he is already the most dangerous person in this story. For John, though, the arithmetic had changed again, and in his favour. 3 brothers had become 1. He was no longer the 4th son of a large family. He was the younger of 2, and only Richard stood between him and everything. And Richard at that moment had no children, no interest in acquiring any, and a stated intention of going on crusade, which in the 12th century was an activity with a mortality rate that would horrify a modern actuary. Meanwhile the old king was failing. Henry II had spent 35 years in the saddle, holding an ungovernable collection of territories together by sheer restless personal energy. And the energy was running out. He was ill, he was tired, and he was still refusing to say plainly in public that Richard would inherit everything. That refusal was not stupidity. It was strategy, and it was the strategy Henry had used all his life. As long as the succession stayed slightly ambiguous, his sons had to keep courting him. The moment he confirmed it, he became irrelevant to the man who would outlive him. Richard, who had watched his father play this game since childhood, drew the obvious conclusion. If the old man will not confirm it, he intends to give it to John. Whether that was ever true is one of the great unanswerable questions of the period. But Richard believed it, and belief was enough. In 1188 he did something that no Angevin son had quite done before. He went to Philip of France, knelt, and did homage to him for the continental lands. He formally acknowledged the King of France as his lord, in public, in front of witnesses. And then the two of them went to war against his father. The campaign of 1189 was short and merciless. Philip was young, patient and calculating, a very different animal from his father Louis. Richard was the best field commander alive, and Henry II, sick and shrinking, was chased from town to town through the country of his birth. He lost Le Mans, the city where he had been born, and reportedly cursed God as he rode away from it. At Ballon, near Tours, he was forced to accept humiliating terms, kneeling to Philip, kissing his son, and agreeing to everything demanded of him. There was one final condition. He was to be given the list of the barons who had conspired against him, so that they might be pardoned. The list was brought to him, and the first name on it was John's. The chroniclers say he turned his face to the wall and stopped fighting. 2 days later, on the 6th of July, 1189, Henry II died at Chinon, attended by almost nobody, his body reportedly stripped by his own servants before it was cold. Now I want to be careful here, because this is the moment where legend takes over from evidence. The story that Henry died of a broken heart on learning of John's betrayal is far too neat, and it comes to us from writers who already knew how John's life would end and were arranging the past to point at it. The man had been coughing blood for weeks. He had an infection, a fistula, and 35 years of relentless campaigning in his body. He died of being 66 and exhausted in an age without medicine. But the story stuck. And that is a pattern worth noticing early, because it will repeat for the rest of tonight. Again and again, things that happen near John get retold as things that happened because of John. Richard was crowned in September and immediately made his priorities clear. He was going on crusade. Saladin had taken Jerusalem 2 years earlier, and the whole of Christendom was mobilizing, and Richard, who had wanted this his entire life, was not going to be delayed by the tedious business of governing England. He needed money, enormous amounts of it, and he raised it by selling absolutely everything that was not nailed down. Offices, sheriffdoms, charters, lordships, exemptions. He is supposed to have said that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. It is probably not a real quote. It is a perfectly accurate summary of his policy. He also needed to solve the John problem. His solution was generosity on a scale that looks, from a distance, like a bribe. He gave John an enormous block of English territory, 6 entire counties in the west and southwest, with their revenues and their castles, plus the county of Morton in Normandy, plus a marriage to Isabella of Gloucester, one of the wealthiest heiresses in England. Overnight, the man called Lackland became one of the greatest landholders in the kingdom. And in exchange, Richard extracted a promise. Stay out of England for 3 years. Then he sailed for the Holy Land, leaving the government in the hands of his chancellor, William de Longchamp, a man of low birth, high ambition, and spectacularly poor social skills. Longchamp was efficient. He was also arrogant, he spoke no English, he despised the English aristocracy, and he made no effort to hide any of it. Within a year he had alienated essentially every baron in the kingdom. And here is where I want to complicate the story you think you know. The version everyone has absorbed from 1,000 retellings of Robin Hood is that the noble king went to war and his scheming brother tried to steal the throne behind his back. What actually happened in 1191 is that the political community of England, the barons and the bishops, found the government intolerable and turned to the only member of the royal family available, which was John. When Longchamp arrested and imprisoned a royal official in defiance of a settlement, it was John who summoned the council at which Longchamp was deposed, and the barons and clergy backed him. Was John acting in his brother's interest or his own? Both, obviously both. He was building a power base and he knew it. But he was not acting alone, and he was not acting against the wishes of the kingdom. He was doing what the kingdom asked, in a way that happened to suit him enormously. Then the news came from Germany, and everything changed. The Third Crusade had ended in a negotiated truce. Richard had won a string of victories and had not taken Jerusalem. On the way home, with the sea routes and the French roads closed to him because he had managed to offend nearly every ruler in Europe, he tried to cross overland through Austria in disguise. He was recognised, arrested by Duke Leopold, whose banner he had insulted at Acre, and handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor. The King of England was a prisoner, and the ransom demanded was 150,000 marks, roughly 2 or 3 times the entire annual revenue of the English crown. John's response was, and there is no gentle way to phrase this, the single most damaging thing he ever did to his own reputation. He went to Paris. He knelt to Philip and did homage for the continental lands. He agreed to hand over great chunks of Normandy. He returned to England and told anyone who would listen that his brother was dead or would never return, and began seizing castles. And he wrote to the emperor, alongside Philip, offering money to keep Richard in captivity longer. That letter is the thing. Everything else was ordinary medieval opportunism, the kind of behaviour every one of his relatives had engaged in. Paying to keep your own brother in a foreign prison is a different category of act. It also failed completely. Eleanor of Aquitaine, now over 70 and released from her long confinement, took charge of raising the ransom with a ferocity that must have terrified the Exchequer. Every layman and cleric in England paid a quarter of their movable property. The wool crop of the Cistercian monasteries was seized outright. Church plate was melted down, and in February of 1194 Richard walked free. Philip sent John a note, "Look to yourself, the devil is loosed." John did the sensible thing and fled, and eventually crawled back to face his brother at Lisieux, throwing himself at Richard's feet in what must have been the most excruciating moment of his life. And Richard forgave him, not out of warmth and not out of weakness, but out of a very cold assessment. Killing John solved nothing. The alternative heir was a 7-year-old boy in Brittany surrounded by advisers who hated England. The words Richard is said to have used were devastating precisely because they were kind. "You are a child," he told his 27-year-old brother, who has had bad counsellors about him. It was mercy delivered as an insult, and it was the most public possible statement that John did not matter enough to punish. For roughly a year after that, John was nobody. He was excluded from the great councils, stripped of most of the lands Richard had given him, and permitted to exist at the edge of the court like a man serving out a sentence. His castles were held by other men. His revenues went elsewhere. He had made his play for the throne and lost, and the price of losing was to be visible to everyone as a person who had tried and failed. But Richard was not sentimental in either direction, and he was practical about talent. Slowly the lands came back, and to everyone's mild surprise, John turned out to be genuinely useful. He was given command in the wars against Philip in Normandy, and he did well. He captured Vreux. He led a force that took a substantial number of French knights prisoner at St. Valery. He was not his brother, and never would be, but he was competent, energetic, and he understood sieges and supply, which is most of what medieval warfare actually consists of. Those 5 years, from 1194 to 1199, are the part of John's life nobody ever talks about, and they are the part that most complicates the legend. because for half a decade he was a loyal, effective royal lieutenant, and there is no evidence at all that he schemed against his brother even once. Richard, meanwhile, spent those years doing what he was born to do, which was clawing back the territory Philip had taken while he was in prison, castle by castle, and at the centre of that effort he built the thing he considered his masterpiece. Chateau Gaillard stood on a chalk cliff above the Seine at Les Andelys, guarding the river approach to Roanne, and therefore to the whole of Normandy. It went up in about 2 years, which for a fortress of that size was almost supernatural speed, and it incorporated every idea Richard had brought back from the Crusader castles of the East. Concentric defences, rounded towers with no blind angles, machicolations, walls that curved so that no ram could sit square against them. It cost more than Richard spent on every castle in England put together during his entire reign. He looked at it when it was finished, and reportedly said that he could hold it if the walls were made of butter. Hold that castle in your mind. We will be back at it, and it is going to matter enormously. In the spring of 1199, Richard went to deal with a very minor problem. A viscount in the Limousin, one of his own vassals, had allegedly found buried treasure and refused to hand over the royal share. Or possibly he had simply refused a summons, and the treasure is a later embellishment. Either way, Richard rode south to besiege a small and unimpressive castle called Clous-Chabrol, defended by a garrison so thin that the chroniclers claim only 2 men were actually manning the walls properly. On the evening of the 26th of March, Richard walked around the perimeter to inspect the siege works without bothering to put on his full mail. A crossbowman on the wall, who had been fending off bolts all day with a frying pan for a shield, took his shot. It went into Richard's left shoulder near the neck. The wound itself should not have been fatal. What killed him was the extraction, botched by a surgeon working by torchlight, and then gangrene, which no one in 1199 could do anything about at all. He lasted 11 days. And in those 11 days he did 2 things that shaped everything that follows. The first was an act of grace that has kept the story alive for 8 centuries. He had the crossbowman brought before him, and pardoned him, and ordered that he be released with money in his hand. The shot, he said, had been fair. The moment Richard was dead, his mercenary captain had the boy flayed alive and hanged, because the age was not sentimental, and neither were the people in it. The second thing was that he named his heir, not Arthur of Brittany, who was now 12, and had spent most of his short life being raised as an instrument of French policy. John, on the 6th of April 1199, Richard the Lionheart died in his mother's arms, and the 4th son, the spare part, the boy who had been given nothing because there was nothing left to give, inherited the greatest collection of territories in Western Europe. He was 32 years old, and he was walking into a trap. Let me lay out the position he actually inherited, because this is the heart of the case for the defence, and it deserves to be stated plainly. First, the treasury was empty and worse than empty. Richard's crusade had cost a fortune. The ransom had cost a second fortune, extracted from a kingdom that had already been squeezed. The 5 years of war in Normandy had cost a third. The English crown in 1199 was carrying the financial hangover of a decade of extraordinary expenditure, and the barons had been paying for all of it and were extremely tired of paying. Second, the succession was disputed, and there was no rule to settle it. Modern people assume primogeniture, the eldest son inherits, and if he is dead his son inherits before any uncle. In 1199, that principle existed as an argument, not as a law. The competing principle, that a proven adult male of the blood is preferable to a child, existed equally. Both had precedent. Both had supporters. Which meant that every lord in the Angevin lands got to choose which principle he preferred, and unsurprisingly each of them chose whichever one benefited him. Normandy declared for John, because Normandy had no wish to be ruled from Brittany. England declared for John, because the great men there, led by an aging knight named William Marshal, wanted an adult king. Aquitaine declared for John because his 80-year-old mother was still very much alive and said so. Anjou, Maine, Touraine, the ancestral heartland, declared for Arthur. Third, and most importantly, Philip of France was no longer the young man who had gone on crusade and come home with the sniffles. He had spent a decade becoming the most patient and effective political operator in Europe. And he had finally understood something none of his predecessors had grasped. He did not have to beat the Angevins in the field. He had to beat them in the courtroom. Every scrap of Angevin land on the continent was held as a fief of the French crown. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, all of it. The King of England on French soil was legally the King of France's man. For 100 years that had been a technicality that everyone ignored because the Angevins were too strong to be pushed. Philip's insight was that the technicality was a weapon, and that he could use the machinery of feudal law itself to strip his rival bare, with the whole of Europe agreeing that he was in the right. So John's first act as king was to sail immediately for the continent, because that is where the crisis was, and to begin the exhausting work of buying loyalty. Charters to towns, commune status to cities, granting them self-government and trading privileges, grants to monasteries, promises to lords. It was expensive and it was effective, and over the following months Anjou and Maine came over to him. By May of 1200 he had negotiated a settlement, the Treaty of Les Goulets, and honestly it was not a bad piece of work. Philip formally recognised John as Richard's heir and as overlord of Brittany, which meant Arthur became John's vassal rather than his rival. In exchange, John gave up a slice of the Norman Vexin, that strategically vital wedge of land between Normandy and Paris, paid a relief of 20,000 marks for his inheritance, and formally acknowledged that he held his continental lands from the King of France. His own barons grumbled. Some of them started calling him Softsword, which is exactly as unsubtle an insult as it sounds, and it stuck. Richard would have fought, they said. Richard would never have paid. But look at what John had actually achieved. He was recognised as king. Arthur's independent claim was dead. The empire was intact. He had traded some land and a great deal of money for peace and legitimacy, which for a man with an empty treasury and a contested title was arguably the correct trade. The homage was the poison in it. By kneeling and acknowledging Philip as his lord in that formal, witnessed, legally binding way, John had handed his enemy the one thing his enemy needed. A lord may summon his vassal to court. A vassal who refuses to come may be tried in his absence. And a vassal, convicted of contumacy, of contemptuous refusal, may be lawfully stripped of his fiefs. Philip now had the key. He simply needed a reason to turn it. John handed him one within 3 months, and he did it of all things over a marriage. His first marriage to Isabella of Gloucester had never been much of a marriage. They were second cousins, the church had objected from the beginning, they had no children, and John had spent a decade not particularly caring. Now that he was king, he wanted an annulment, and he got one on the reliable grounds of consanguinity, which by this point in our story you will recognise as the standard family exit door. That was ordinary. What he did next was not. In August of 1200, John married Isabella of Angoulême. She was around 12 years old, which was legally permissible and socially normal for a dynastic match in 1200, and modern discomfort with it is entirely justified, but not what made it a catastrophe at the time. What made it a catastrophe was that she was already betrothed. Her fiancé was Hugh de Lusignan, called Hugh the Brown, head of one of the most powerful families in Poitou. And John did not merely take his bride. He took her, offered no compensation, and then, when the Lusignans protested, harassed them, seized their lands, and drove them into open resistance. The Lusignans then did the single most intelligent thing anyone in this story does. They did not rebel. They appealed. They went to Paris, to the court of King Philip, and asked their overlord's overlord for justice against a vassal who had denied them redress. And Philip, who had been waiting patiently for exactly this, smiled and summoned John to appear before him. John did not go. Of course he did not go. That was the whole cruelty of the summons. If he appeared in Paris to be judged, he was accepting in public, before every lord in Europe, that the King of France could put the King of England on trial. If he refused, he was a contumacious vassal, and the sentence for that was forfeiture. He tried to negotiate his way around it. He offered to send representatives. He argued about the venue, insisting that as Duke of Normandy he was entitled to be judged on the Norman frontier by ancient custom, and not dragged to Paris like a country baron. It was a reasonable argument, and it was probably even legally correct. Philip was not interested in being correct. He was interested in being finished. In the spring of 1202, the court of France gave judgment. John, having failed to appear, was declared to have forfeited all the lands he held from the French crown. Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, Aquitaine, all of it gone, by the ruling of a court, without a single arrow being loosed. Now, a court can say anything it likes. Enforcing it is another matter, and Philip knew that too. So he did two things at once. He invaded eastern Normandy himself, and he knighted Arthur of Brittany, now 15, accepted his homage for Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Poitou betrothed him to his own infant daughter and sent him south with a small army to make the judgment real. Arthur, being 15 and having been raised on the idea that he was the rightful King of England, went south with enormous enthusiasm and a plan that was almost brilliant. He learned that his grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was travelling with a small escort and had stopped at the castle of Mirabeau in Poitou. Eleanor was the linchpin of the entire southern position. She was the living authority behind John's claim to Aquitaine, and every lord in the south who supported John did so at least partly because she said to. Take her, and the south collapses. So Arthur besieged his own 80-year-old grandmother. She got a message out. And what happened next is the finest thing John ever did, and it deserves to be told properly, because it demonstrates beyond argument that the man was not incompetent. John was at Le Mans, roughly 80 miles away. He got the message, gathered his forces, and moved. In the medieval world, armies covered perhaps 15 or 20 miles a day. John's force covered 80 miles in 48 hours, arriving at dawn on the 1st of August 1202, when Arthur's men had taken the town and were relaxed and comfortable, and had, in a detail that historians have enjoyed for centuries, blocked all but one of the town gates and left that one open so they could get breakfast. John came through the open gate. It was over in a morning. He captured Arthur. He captured Hugh de Lusignan and his brother. He captured over 200 knights, essentially the entire military leadership of the rebellion, in a single stroke. His mother was safe. His enemies were in chains. Philip, hearing the news in Normandy, abandoned his siege and pulled back. Contemporaries were astonished. This was a Richard-quality operation, executed with a speed Richard himself would have admired. In one morning John had won the war, and within about 8 months he had lost everything, and it was entirely his own doing. The trouble started with what he did with the prisoners. Medieval warfare among the aristocracy operated on an understood system. Captured knights were ransomed. They were held honourably, often in reasonable comfort, and returned to their families for money. It was less a matter of morality than of mutual insurance, because everyone involved expected to be captured themselves eventually. John had the prisoners loaded into carts, in chains, and paraded them. Then he distributed them among his castles in England and Normandy, and a number of them, 22 by the most cited account, were held at Corfe Castle and starved to death. The effect on the Poitevin nobility was immediate and permanent. These were not distant enemies. These were the sons, brothers, and cousins of every significant family in the region, and their families were watching. Men who had been wavering stopped wavering. Men who had supported John reconsidered. William des Roches, the most important baron in Anjou, the man who had actually brought Anjou over to Jon's side and who had been promised a say in Arthur's treatment, defected within weeks and took Anjou with him. Jon had turned a total military victory into a political catastrophe by refusing to be gracious for 8 weeks. And then there was Arthur. The boy was moved to Falaise and then to the great castle at Rouen. And somewhere in Rouen, sometime around Easter of 1203, Arthur of Brittany disappeared from history. Nobody knows what happened. That is the honest answer, and it needs saying plainly. There is no body, no confession, no document, no trial. What there is instead is a swarm of rumours that began circulating almost immediately and have never stopped. One account from the Annals of Margam Abbey is horribly specific. It says that on the Thursday before Easter, after dinner, drunk and possessed by the devil, Jon killed the boy with his own hand and had the body weighted with a stone and thrown into the Seine, where it was later found by a fisherman. Another account says Jon ordered him blinded and castrated, and that the man given the order, Hubert de Burgh, could not do it and spread word that the boy had died, hoping to defuse the rebellion, and then had to admit he was alive when the news made things worse. A third simply says he died of natural causes in captivity, which happened to prisoners constantly. What can be said with confidence is this: Arthur was alive in Jon's custody. Then he was not. And Jon never produced him, alive or dead, at any point afterward, despite the fact that producing a living Arthur would have solved several of his problems instantly. That silence is the closest thing to evidence there is. And medieval Europe drew the obvious conclusion. Here is the thing that gets lost in the moral horror of it, though. The murder of Arthur, if it was a murder, was not just wicked, it was strategically insane. Alive, Arthur was Jon's single greatest asset, a hostage who neutralised Brittany and gave Philip nothing to rally behind. Dead, he was a martyr, and every lord in the Angevin lands now had a reason to believe that submitting to Jon was not safe, and that rebelling against him was not merely permitted, but righteous. Brittany rose. Anjou was already gone, and in Normandy the barons began quietly, one by one, deciding that they would rather be Philip's men. Because that is the other thing modern retellings miss. The Norman barons were not English patriots being conquered by foreigners. They were French lords who held land in France, from a duke who happened to also be King of England. And Philip was offering them the chance to hold that same land in peace from a king who was actually present. Many of them held lands on both sides of the border and were being forced to choose, and Jon was becoming, by the day, the less attractive option. He also began behaving strangely. Chroniclers describe him during the winter of 1203 as sluggish, staying in bed late, feasting, showing no urgency while castle after castle fell. Some of that is hostile writing. But something was wrong. He suspected everyone, and the terrible thing is that he was right to. He could not tell which of his own commanders would hold and which would open the gates. So he trusted no one, delegated nothing, and moved constantly between fortresses, which is precisely the behaviour of a man who is losing and knows it. And Philip, meanwhile, went to Chau-Gaillard. Richard's masterpiece, the Castle of Butterwalls, the strongest fortress in Western Europe, held by Roger de Lacy, one of the toughest men in Jon's service. The siege began in September of 1203. Philip did not attempt to storm it. He sat down around it and settled in for as long as it took, cutting the river, building his own siege works, methodically demonstrating that no relief was coming. John did try once in an ambitious combined night attack by land and river that failed largely because the river force arrived hours late due to the tide. After that, nothing. The siege lasted 6 months. There is one detail from it that I include only because it tells you what these things were really like beneath the romance. De Lacy, running short of food, expelled the non-combatants from the castle, the townspeople who had sheltered there. Philip refused to let them through his lines. So several hundred people spent the winter in the ditch between the two armies, in the freezing mud, eating whatever they could find, until Philip eventually relented and let the survivors pass. Stoke Yard fell on the 6th of March 1204, when a small party found a way in through a latrine chute. After that it was not a war anymore, it was a collapse. Falaise surrendered. Caen surrendered. Rome, the capital of Normandy, held out for a few weeks, asked John for relief, received none, and opened its gates on the 24th of June. Normandy, held by John's family for nearly 300 years since Rollo, was gone in under a year. And in the middle of it, on the 1st of April 1204, Eleanor of Aquitaine died at Fontevraud at the age of about 82. She had been Queen of France and Queen of England. She had outlived 2 husbands, 8 of her 10 children, and every rival she ever had, and her death removed the last personal thread holding Aquitaine to John, which is why Porto began sliding away almost immediately. By the end of 1204 of his father's great inheritance, John held England, Ireland, a fragment of Porto, and Gascony in the far south. He was 37, and he had lost an empire, and the sensible thing at that point would have been to accept it. He did not accept it. He was never going to accept it. And that refusal is what turns the rest of his reign into a slow-motion disaster. Because here is what John decided in the wreckage of 1204, and it is the decision that explains everything that follows. He decided he was going to take Normandy back. Not eventually. Not as an aspiration to be mentioned at feasts. As a policy funded and planned and pursued with absolute single-mindedness for the next 10 years. Everything he did from this point forward, every tax, every fine, every seizure, every act of pressure that made his barons hate him, flowed from that one objective. And to understand why that objective destroyed him, you have to understand what it cost. Reconquering Normandy meant hiring mercenaries, because you could not do it with feudal levies who served 40 days and went home. It meant building a fleet, because you had to get there. It meant buying allies on the continent, because you could not beat Philip alone. It meant, in short, cash, on a scale that no English king had ever needed before, from a country that had already been drained twice in living memory. So John became the most efficient and most hated tax collector in English history. And I want to be fair to him here, because the efficiency is genuinely impressive, and it is the part of his reign that professional historians admire. The man was a superb administrator. He was fascinated by the details of government in a way his brother never had been. He travelled constantly, hearing legal cases in person, and the records suggest he was actually rather good at it. Ordinary people sometimes did better in John's courts than they had before, particularly against powerful neighbours, because John enjoyed cutting powerful neighbours down. He reorganised the exchequer. He standardised record-keeping so thoroughly that the reign of King John is where the modern documentary history of English government essentially begins. He built up a real navy, the foundation of what would become the royal fleet. But the money. He raised the scutage, the payment barons made in lieu of military service, repeatedly and at rates never seen before. Richard had levied it 3 times in 10 years. John levied it 11 times in 17. He revived and exploited the forest law with a ferocity that made it notorious. Royal forest was not woodland in the modern sense. It was any land, including farms and villages, designated as subject to special royal jurisdiction, and roughly a quarter of England fell under it. Within it you could be fined for hunting, obviously, but also for gathering firewood, clearing scrub, letting your dog run untrimmed, building a fence, or possessing a bow. John extended the boundaries and enforced the fines, and the forest law became one of the great grievances of the reign. He weaponized feudal instance. When a baron died, his heir paid a relief to inherit. The customary figure was around £100. John charged whatever he thought he could extract. One man was charged the almost unimaginable sum of 10,000 marks for his inheritance and for permission to marry the woman he wanted. He sold widows, that is not a metaphor. The marriage of an heiress or a widow was in the king's gift, and John auctioned them, or charged the women enormous sums for the right not to be married off to whoever bid highest. And he ran all of it on a system of debt and pressure. He would allow a baron to owe him money, and then that debt sat there, callable at any moment, a leash. Behave, and the debt sleeps. Displease the king, and the whole sum is demanded at once, which nobody could pay, which meant your castles were forfeit. The revenues doubled. By 1212, he had accumulated a treasure of perhaps 200,000 marks, an astonishing hoard, and the price of it was that every powerful man in England now lived in fear of him personally. Which brings us to the de Braos affair, the single episode, that did more to convince the English baronage that John was dangerous than anything else in his reign. William de Braos was not an enemy. He was John's friend, one of his closest and most favoured supporters, a marcher lord of enormous power in Wales and Ireland who had been showered with grants. He had also been at Rayne. Whatever happened to Arthur, William de Braosay was in a position to know. In 1208, John called in his debts. De Braosay owed money for lordships he had been granted, as everyone did, on terms nobody expected to be enforced. John demanded payment in full and demanded hostages, which was standard practice, sons handed over as security for good behaviour. And Matilda de Braos, William's wife, refused, and she said why out loud in front of the king's officers. She would not, she said, hand her sons to the man who had murdered his own nephew. That was the end of the de Braosay family. John pursued them with a relentlessness that went far beyond politics. Their lands were seized. They fled to Ireland, and John took an army to Ireland after them, which had the side benefit of letting him break the independence of the Anglo-Norman lords there and install his own men. William escaped to France disguised as a beggar and died in exile. Matilda and her eldest son were caught and taken to England and put in a cell at Corfe Castle, and the door was shut. 11 days later it was opened. They were both dead of starvation. The Chronicle account, and I include it because its horror is precisely why it was remembered, says that the son had been dead some days, and that his mother had bitten into his cheek. Now the mechanics of that story may have grown in the telling. What did not need embellishing was the fact itself. A noblewoman and her heir, members of the great families, people related by blood or marriage to half the baronage of England, had been deliberately starved to death in a royal castle without trial. Every baron in England did the same arithmetic that night. If it could happen to de Braosay, the king's own friend, it could happen to any of them. There was no law protecting them. There was only the king's mood. That, more than the taxes, is what eventually produced Magna Carta. The taxes were a grievance. The de Braosays were a warning. While all this was happening, John was also fighting the church, and losing, and then winning in the strangest way imaginable. It began with a vacancy. Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died in 1205. The Archbishop was the most powerful churchman in England, and controlled enormous wealth, and John naturally wanted his own man in the post, choosing John de Grey, Bishop of Norwich, a loyal servant. The monks of Canterbury, who claimed the right of election, had already secretly elected their own sub-prior and rushed him off to Rome. The bishops of the province claimed a say as well. 3 competing claims went to the papacy. And the Pope at that moment was Innocent III, the most powerful pontiff of the Middle Ages, a trained lawyer with an expansive view of papal authority who had already forced the King of France to take back a wife he had discarded. Innocent looked at the mess, threw out every candidate, and appointed his own choice. Cardinal Stephen Langton. On paper, Langton was unimpeachable. He was English by birth. He was one of the finest theologians in Europe, the man who divided the Bible into the chapters we still use today. There was no scholarly objection to him at all. The problem was that he had spent most of his adult life in Paris, at a university under the patronage of the King of France, and John had just lost Normandy to the King of France. From John's chair, Appointing Langton looked less like an ecclesiastical decision and more like planting an enemy asset at the centre of the kingdom. He refused to accept him and refused to let him into England. Innocent applied pressure in stages, the way a lawyer does. First, in 1208, the interdict. The entire kingdom was placed under a suspension of religious services. No masses, no church weddings, no burials in consecrated ground. Only the baptism of infants and confession for the dying were permitted. For a population that believed, absolutely and literally, that these things determined the fate of their souls, this was an extraordinary act of collective punishment. It lasted 6 years, and John's response to the interdict is the most perfectly characteristic thing he ever did. He did not agonize. He looked at a church that had stopped performing services, and he asked a simple question. If you are not doing the job the endowments were given for, why are you keeping the endowments? He seized the property of the English church wholesale. The revenues of every vacant bishopric and abbey flowed straight into his treasury, and he made sure a great many of them became vacant. It is estimated the interdict earned him something over 100,000 marks. The Pope's punishment turned out to be the single most profitable event of his reign. So in 1209, Innocent escalated. John was excommunicated personally. This was genuinely dangerous. An excommunicated king could, in theory, be abandoned by his vassals without sin. His subjects could be released from their oaths, and a war against him could be declared a crusade, with all the spiritual rewards that implied. By 1212 there were credible reports that Innocent was preparing to formally depose him, and that Philip of France was assembling an invasion fleet with papal blessing, which for Philip would have been the single greatest opportunity of his life. John had to break the deadlock. And in May of 1213 he did it with a masterstroke so audacious that it still makes historians blink. He surrendered completely. He accepted Langton, agreed to compensate the church, and then went further than anyone had asked. He gave England and Ireland to the Pope. He resigned his kingdoms into the hands of Innocent III and received them back as a papal fief, agreeing to hold them as the Pope's vassal and to pay an annual tribute of 1,000 marks. Look at what that did. Overnight, John went from being the Pope's principal enemy in Europe to being one of his most valued vassals, and the papacy now had a direct financial and political interest in John's survival. Philip's invasion, which had been a holy enterprise a week earlier, was now an attack on papal property. The invasion was called off. His barons found it humiliating, his enemies found it infuriating, Innocent found it delightful, and John, freed at last, turned back to the only thing he had ever really wanted. Normandy, 9 years of taxation had bought him something remarkable. He had a treasury, a fleet, an army of paid professionals, and most importantly, a plan that was actually rather clever. The plan was this. John would not attempt to punch straight into Normandy, where Philip was strongest and where every castle was now in French hands. Instead, he would land in the south, in Poitou, his last remaining foothold, and drive north into Anjou. That would pull Philip's army south to meet him. And while Philip was committed in the south, a second army, a coalition of every enemy France had, would cross the northeastern frontier and march on Paris. The coalition was genuinely formidable, and assembling it was John's diplomatic masterpiece. It included the Count of Flanders and the Count of Boulogne, both of whom had their own reasons to loathe Philip. It included the Duke of Brabant. And at its head was the Holy Roman Emperor, Otto IV, who happened to be John's nephew, the son of his sister Matilda, and who had spent years being undermined by papal and French diplomacy. John had spent an enormous amount of money buying these men. That is what the forest fines and the scuttages and the sold widows had all been for. There was a preliminary success that showed the plan could work. In May of 1213, an English fleet under the Earl of Salisbury caught the French invasion fleet at anchor in the Flemish port of Down and destroyed or captured essentially all of it. Hundreds of ships and a vast quantity of supplies and treasure. Philip's naval capacity was wiped out in an afternoon. It was the most successful English naval action for centuries, and it meant the sea was John's. In February of 1214, John sailed for La Rochelle, and at first it went beautifully. He moved through Poitou securing homages, and the Lusignans, of all people, came over to him after he arranged a marriage between his daughter and Hugh de Lusignan's son. He pushed north. He took Angers. He besieged the castle of Rochemoyne. Prince Louis, Philip's son, came south to face him with a French army, and John, who had brought a substantial force, prepared to give battle. Then his Poitevin barons refused to fight. This is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the whole story. They had done homage. They had marched with him. And when it came to a pitched battle against the King of France in person, or his heir, they simply would not do it, whether from divided loyalty, or from calculation about who would still be there next year, or from plain distrust of John himself. They declined. Without them, John could not fight. He withdrew, abandoning his siege equipment, and the southern half of the campaign was effectively finished, which meant everything now depended on the north. On the 27th of July 1214, near a bridge over the River Marquet outside a village called Bouvines, the coalition army met King Philip of France. The numbers were roughly comparable, perhaps slight advantage to the Allies. It was a Sunday, and there was an assumption on the Allied side that Philip would not fight on a Sunday, which is why they were caught somewhat unprepared while his forces were crossing the bridge. It lasted about 3 hours, and it was a catastrophe. Otto's centre broke. The Emperor's horse was killed under him, his standard, an eagle on a pole, was captured, and Otto fled the field, an act that destroyed his imperial career permanently. On the wings, the Count of Flanders was captured. The Count of Boulogne, who fought with legendary stubbornness in a ring of pikemen, was captured. William Longespy, Earl of Salisbury, John's own half-brother, and the hero of Dam, was captured. Bouvines is one of the most consequential battles in European history, and it decided far more than one campaign. It confirmed France as the dominant power on the continent, made Philip the most secure monarch in Europe, and shattered the German imperial position so thoroughly that Otto was replaced within a few years. And for John, it was the end. Not of a war. Of everything. 10 years of relentless, hated, kingdom-wide extraction. 10 years of forest fines and widows sold, and debts called in and hostages taken, had been spent on this single throw. And it had been lost in 3 hours, in a field, by an army he was not even present with. He negotiated a truce, agreed to a substantial indemnity, and sailed home in October of 1214. He never set foot on the continent again. Now imagine being an English baron in the autumn of 1214. For a decade you have been paying. You have paid scutage after scutage, at rates your grandfather would not have believed. Your neighbour's inheritance was priced at a sum that ruined him. Your cousin's widow was sold. You have watched a friend of the king's be hounded to death in a dungeon at Corfe. You have handed over your own son as a hostage. You have been fined for a fence, a dog, a stand of timber. And you have been told, every time, that it was for Normandy. And now, Normandy is gone forever. The treasure is gone. The coalition is gone. And the king has come home with nothing, and immediately, begins demanding another scutage from the men who did not come with him to Poitiers. That is the moment the reign ends, even though John had 2 more years to live. Because from that point on, there was no answer to the question of what any of it had been for. The resistance began in the north, among barons who had never crossed the sea for him, and it spread, and it took a form that had no real precedent, which is the genuinely extraordinary thing about it. Medieval rebellions were normally about who should be king. A pretender was produced, banners were raised in his name, and the country chose sides. That was the pattern for centuries. This one was not about who. There was no obvious alternative. Arthur was dead. John's own sons were small children. So instead, the rebels did something new. They started arguing about what a king was permitted to do. The intellectual architecture came, ironically, from the man John had fought so hard to keep out of England. Stephen Langton, now firmly installed as Archbishop of Canterbury, and a serious scholar of the moral limits of authority, reportedly produced for the barons an old and largely forgotten document. The Charter of Liberties, issued by Henry I at his coronation over a century earlier, in which a king had promised to abstain from certain specific abuses. It was almost a dead letter. But it was proof of principle. It established that a king of England had once, in writing, accepted limits on himself, which meant a king of England could be asked to do so again. Through the winter of 1214 and into 1215, the barons pressed. John played for time with enormous skill. He took the cross, vowing to go on crusade, which conferred legal protections on his person and property that made attacking him considerably more awkward. He appealed to his new overlord in Rome, and Innocent, loyally, wrote to the barons ordering them to desist and threatening excommunication. It did not work. In May of 1215 the rebels formally renounced their homage, and then they took London, which opened its gates to them, and the moment London fell John's position became untenable. So in June he agreed to talk. They met in a meadow beside the Thames at Runnymede, chosen because it was neutral ground between the royal castle at Windsor and the rebel camp at Staines, and because in an open field neither side could be ambushed. What was hammered out over several days is a strange document. Most of it is not lofty at all. It is a detailed, grinding, item-by-item list of complaints from men who had been financially squeezed for a decade. Reliefs are fixed at £100. Widows shall not be forced to remarry. Debts to the crown shall not be enforced while an heir is under age. Fish weirs shall be removed from the Thames and the Medway. The forests John had extended shall be disafforested. There shall be 1 measure of wine and 1 of ale throughout the realm. But scattered among the fish weirs are a handful of sentences that turned out to be immortal. That no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. That to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay, right or justice. Those clauses were written by frightened men thinking about Corfe Castle and Matilda de Braose. They were not thinking about liberty in the abstract. They were thinking, very specifically, that this must never be allowed to happen to us. And then there was Clause 61, which is the one that made peace impossible. It established a council of 25 barons, chosen by the rebels, with the authority to monitor the king's compliance. If the king breached the charter, 4 of them would present the complaint. If he did not remedy it within 40 days, the 25 were empowered to seize his castles, lands, and possessions by force until he did. That is not a limitation on a king. That is a committee with the legal right to make war on him, written into his own charter under his own seal. John sealed it on the 15th of June 1215, and absolutely nobody involved believed for a second that it would hold. The king sent messengers to Rome almost immediately. Innocent III received the document, read it, and responded with a fury that is remarkable even in papal correspondence. This was, he declared, shameful and demeaning, illegal and unjust, extorted from a king by force. It weakened royal rights and dishonoured the English people. He annulled it. He declared it null and void of all validity forever, and forbade the king to observe it or the barons to demand it, on pain of excommunication. The charter had lasted roughly 10 weeks, and England went to war. The First Barons' War began in the autumn of 1215, and the first thing to say about it is that John fought it extremely well. That surprises people, because by this stage of the story we have all decided what kind of man we are dealing with. That the John of 1215 and 1216 is not a passive victim of events. He is a hard, fast, experienced campaigner with a treasury still capable of hiring professionals, and for several months he ran rings around his enemies. His first target was Rochester Castle, which the rebels held and which sat squarely on the road between London and the coast. The siege that followed is one of the great sieges of English history. John brought 5 stone-throwing engines and worked them day and night. When the walls held, he had his miners dig beneath the corner of the great keep, propping the tunnel with timber, and then he sent an order to his Justicia that has survived, and is one of the most peculiar documents of the age. "Send with all speed," he wrote, 40 of the fattest pigs of the sort least good for eating, to bring fire beneath the tower. They packed the mine with pig fat and set it alight, and the timber props burned through, and the entire southeast corner of the keep collapsed. Even then the garrison fought on, retreating behind the cross wall inside and holding out until they were eating their horses. When they finally surrendered after nearly 2 months, John wanted to hang them all, and was talked out of it by one of his own captains, who pointed out that if the king started hanging garrisons, his own men could expect the same treatment. A chronicler wrote afterward that few would now put their trust in castles, which is quite a thing to say about the age of castles. From Rochester, John split his forces. He sent one army into East Anglia and took the other north himself, and through the winter of 1215 and 1216 he conducted a campaign of extraordinary speed and considerable brutality, burning rebel estates from Nottingham to Berwick, forcing the King of Scots back over the border, and terrifying the northern barons into submission. His mercenary captains, men from Poitou and Flanders with no local ties and no local mercy, did the work. By the spring of 1216, John had effectively won. The rebels held London and very little else. Their cause was collapsing. So they did the only thing left. They offered the crown of England to a foreigner. Prince Louis of France, Philip's son, had a claim of sorts through his wife, Blanche of Castile, who was a granddaughter of Henry II. It was thin. Nobody cared. What mattered was that Louis had money, ships, and an army, and that the barons had run out of other options. Philip publicly kept his distance, because his son invading a papal fief was diplomatically delicate. Privately, he did nothing whatsoever to stop him. John assembled a fleet at Dover to prevent the landing, and it was a good fleet, and it should have worked. And then a storm came up the channel and scattered it, and Louis crossed unopposed and landed in Kent on the 21st of May 1216, and the whole position collapsed with astonishing speed, because it turned out that a great many men who had been willing to submit to John were considerably more willing to submit to a French prince with a real army. Louis took Canterbury. He entered London to acclamation and was proclaimed king at St. Paul's. Winchester fell. And then the defections began, and they were catastrophic. The Earl of Salisbury, John's own half-brother, went over. So did the Earl of Arundel, the Earl of Warenne, and eventually the King of Scots came south to do homage to Louis at Dover. By midsummer, Louis controlled roughly half of England, and John was reduced to a shrinking corps in the west and the Midlands, moving constantly with his mercenaries, avoiding a decisive battle he could not afford to lose. 2 things saved the Plantagenet dynasty in that summer, and neither of them was John. The first was a handful of castles that simply would not fall. Dover, held by Hubert de Burgh, sat on Louis's supply line to France and endured a siege of months without breaking. Windsor held. Lincoln held, defended by a formidable woman named Nicola de la Haye, the hereditary Castellan, who was in her 60s and had no intention of surrendering to anyone. The second was the papacy. As a papal vassal, John had Rome's full institutional weight behind him. Innocent III had died in July, but his successor Honorius III continued the policy without hesitation. Louis was excommunicated, his invasion was condemned, and crucially, the papal legate in England worked tirelessly to keep the bishops and the waverers loyal to the crown. So through September and into October of 1216, John kept moving. He relieved Lincoln. He swung east into the fens to raise support and cut Louis's northern communications. And then, in the second week of October, at Bishop's Lynn on the Norfolk coast, he fell ill. It was dysentery, almost certainly, the same disease that had killed his brother Henry the young king. the same disease that killed more medieval armies than any enemy ever did in an age with no understanding of contaminated water. The chroniclers, being chroniclers, attributed it to a surfeit of peaches and new cider, which is exactly the kind of detail that gets repeated for 800 years because it is funnier than the truth. He was very, very ill, and he kept moving anyway, which tells you something about him. He turned west toward Newark. And to save time, he sent his baggage train across the Wellstream estuary, the tidal marshes at the mouth of the Wash, where a causeway was passable at low tide. They mistimed the tide. The wagons went into the incoming water and the quicksands, and a substantial part of the royal baggage was lost, including, according to several accounts, the crown jewels, the regalia, the plate, and a portion of the treasury. Whether the actual crown of England went into the mud of the Wash is disputed. Some historians think the losses were more modest than the legend, a portion of the household goods rather than the coronation regalia. Others have spent centuries looking for it, and the search has never entirely stopped. What is certain is that a king already losing his kingdom lost his treasure in a swamp on the way to his deathbed, and it is almost too perfect a piece of symbolism for a real life. He reached Newark Castle on the 16th of October, and by then he was dying and knew it. He dictated a will. It is very short, and there is something disarmingly human in it. He asked to be buried at Worcester Cathedral, near the shrine of St. Wulfstan, an Anglo-Saxon saint he had venerated for years. He named 13 executors. He asked them to make restitution to those he had wronged, without specifying who, which given the length of the list was probably wise. And he commended his son and his kingdom to the care of the papal legate and of the one man everybody still trusted. William Marshal. Marshal had served 4 kings. He had served Henry II and Henry the young king and Richard and now John. He had been offered chances to defect and had refused them, not out of affection for John, who he cannot possibly have liked, but because he had given his word. On the night of the 18th of October 1216, in the middle of a great storm, John died at Newark. He was 49, and his kingdom was half occupied by a French prince, and his heir was 9 years old. And here, at the absolute bottom, the story turns. Because the death of John solved the war. Think about what the rebel barons actually wanted. They wanted a king who would not do the things John did. They had invited Louis because Louis was not John, and now John was gone, and what stood in his place was a 9-year-old boy named Henry, who had committed no crimes, taken no hostages, starved nobody, and taxed nobody. The rebellion had been aimed at a person. The person was no longer there. William Marshal understood this immediately. Henry was crowned at Gloucester within 10 days, in a hurried ceremony without the regalia, which was somewhere under the Wash, using a plain gold circlet that may have belonged to his mother. Marshal, who was around 70 years old and had every reason to retire, accepted the regency. And then he did the cleverest thing anyone did in the entire 17 years of this story. He reissued Magna Carta. In the boy king's name, with the papal legate's approval, the government adopted the very document the Pope had annulled and John had gone to war over. Some clauses were dropped, including Clause 61, the Committee of 25, which no functioning government could accept. But the substance was there, and it was now not a concession extorted from a tyrant. It was the declared programme of the new regime, which meant that every rebel baron woke up to discover that the thing he had rebelled to obtain was now being offered to him freely, by a government run by the most respected knight in Christendom, on behalf of a child who had wronged nobody, with the Church's blessing, against a French invader. The defections began at once, and they ran the other way. Louis, who had been winning in the summer, found his English support draining month by month. In May of 1217 his forces were caught and broken in the streets of Lincoln, in a battle the winners cheerfully nicknamed the Lincoln Fair because of the plundering afterward. In August a French relief fleet was destroyed off Sandwich by a smaller English force under Hubert de Burgh, who won partly by getting upwind and throwing quicklime into the enemy's faces. By September, Louis had accepted a settlement, taken a payment, and gone home. The dynasty John had nearly destroyed survived, and his son would go on to reign for 56 years. Which leaves us with the question we started with, and it is time to answer it honestly. Was John really that bad? Let us take it in pieces, slowly, because the honest answer is more interesting than either of the loud ones. Start with the case for the defence, because it is stronger than most people expect. He inherited a genuinely impossible position. That is not special pleading, it is simply true. The Angevin lands were not a state. They were a personal collection, held together by nothing but the loyalty owed to one man, with no shared institutions, no common law, no capital, no bureaucracy spanning them, and no reason for a lord in Anjou to care what a lord in Yorkshire thought. Such a thing can only survive under a ruler of exceptional personal magnetism and constant physical presence, and even then it survives by luck. It had already nearly fallen apart twice under Henry II, who was one of the ablest rulers of the medieval world. It had been raided extensively while Richard was in prison. Its finances had been ruined by a crusade and a ransom before John ever put on the crown. And it faced in Philip Augustus an opponent of a genuinely new type. Philip was not a great soldier. He lost battles, he avoided Richard in the field, and he had none of the glamour of his rivals. What he had instead was patience, an understanding of law as a weapon, and the great structural advantage of being the one man in France to whom everyone else technically owed obedience. He built a permanent administration, a professional treasury, and a body of royal officials, while the Angevins were still governing by riding around personally shouting at people. Philip beat the Angevin Empire because he had built a state and they had not. John was the one holding it when the difference became fatal, but the difference was there before him. Second point for the defence. John was, by the standards of his time, an unusually capable administrator and an unusually diligent judge. This is not a modern revisionist fantasy. It is what the records show. He sat in his own courts constantly. He was interested in the details of cases. He kept records with a thoroughness no English king had managed before, which is why historians can reconstruct his reign in such extraordinary detail, and which is incidentally one reason he looks worse than his predecessors. We know what he did. We only have chronicles for the others. Third, the specific charges have to be weighed properly. Yes, he lost Normandy. Richard nearly lost it too. Yes, he taxed savagely. He was funding a war of reconquest, which is what every one of his critics said they wanted until they saw the bill. Yes, he was suspicious and untrusting. He was surrounded by men who defected repeatedly, and his suspicions were, in a great many documented cases, entirely correct. Now the case for the prosecution. And the case for the prosecution is not primarily about competence. It is about character, and about a specific kind of failure that competence cannot fix. John's fundamental flaw was that nobody could trust him, and he never seemed to understand why that mattered. Medieval kingship ran on personal bonds. There was no police force, no standing army in the modern sense. No civil service that could impose the king's will against the wishes of the men who held the castles. A king ruled because a few hundred powerful men chose to let him, and they chose to let him because of oaths, obligations, and the expectation that the arrangement was reciprocal. You serve me, and I protect you, and there are limits to what I will do to you. John broke that reciprocity systematically. He took hostages from allies as well as enemies. He called in debts as punishment. He seduced the wives and daughters of his own barons, which several chroniclers report, and which, whether or not every instance is true, was believed, and belief was enough. He made peace, and then punished the men he had made peace with. He forgave, and then remembered. Take Mirabeau, the finest hour of his life. He won a total victory, captured every enemy leader, and then destroyed the political benefit of it within weeks by treating honourable prisoners with a cruelty that made every neutral lord in Poitou decide he was not a man you could safely surrender to. That is not bad luck. That is a man who could see the tactical picture with perfect clarity and could not see the human one at all. Take de Braos. Whatever the legal justification for calling in the debt, the pursuit of that family was so relentless, so far in excess of the offence, that it read to everyone watching as personal vengeance dressed as law. And the outcome, a woman and a boy starved in a cell, established beyond argument that being close to John was more dangerous than being his enemy. And take Arthur. We cannot prove John killed him. But John never produced him, and he never explained, and every person in Europe drew the conclusion he did nothing to prevent. If he was innocent, he had the easiest possible defence available and never used it. If he was guilty, then he destroyed his own greatest asset in a fit of temper or fear, and handed Philip a moral cause worth an army. There is a pattern in all of this, and it is the saddest thing about him. John was frequently right about the immediate problem, and almost always wrong about the consequences. He understood leverage, and he did not understand loyalty. He could see what a man could be made to do, and never what a man might be persuaded to want. There is also the matter of nerve. Twice at the decisive moment, he did not fight. Normandy fell in 1204 with John moving from castle to castle, unable to trust any commander enough to give him an army, watching Stow-Gaillard hold for 6 months without launching a serious relief. In 1214 he withdrew from Rochambeau when his own barons refused to stand. Some of that was genuine impossibility. But Softsword, the nickname his own men gave him in 1200, was cruel and it was not baseless. So where does that leave the verdict? I would put it this way. John was not incompetent, and he was not a monster in a world of gentle men. He operated in a family where rebellion was normal, in an age where his father blinded hostages and his brother massacred prisoners at Acre. Judged purely on the ledger of cruelty, he is not obviously worse than his relatives. What he was, uniquely, was untrustworthy in a system that ran entirely on trust. And the reason he is remembered as the worst is not that he did the worst things. It is that he failed at the one thing a medieval king could not fail at, and everyone around him could feel it. Then there is the question of why the reputation became so total, so cartoonish, so permanent, and that has a separate answer, which is about who wrote things down. The chroniclers of John's reign were overwhelmingly monks, and John had spent 6 years seizing church property during the interdict. The two most influential accounts, by Roger of Wendover and his continuator Matthew Paris at St Albans, were written after John's death by men with an institutional grievance and a taste for a good story, and they are where a great many of the most lurid tales originate. Matthew Paris in particular wrote that hell itself was defiled by the presence of John, which is not the sort of remark that comes from dispassionate historical assessment. Then the Tudors got hold of him, and briefly made him a hero, of all things, because a king who defied the Pope was suddenly extremely useful. There are 16th century plays presenting John as a proto-Protestant martyr. Shakespeare's version is more ambiguous, a weak and haunted man rather than a devil. Then the Victorians rediscovered Magna Carta and turned it into the founding document of English liberty, which required a tyrant on the other side of it. A charter about fish weirs and inheritance fees became the birth certificate of freedom, and John became the villain the story needed. The 19th century historians handed down the judgment in its harshest form. And finally, Robin Hood. The Robin Hood legend originally had nothing to do with John at all. The early ballads are set vaguely in the reign of an unnamed King Edward. It was only later, and especially in the 19th century and then in film, that the story was welded onto the absent Richard and the scheming John, giving us the version everybody now carries around without ever having chosen to. So the John in your head is a composite. He is part real king, part revenge by aggrieved monks, part Victorian morality play, part Hollywood. And here is the final irony, the one worth taking to bed with you. John's lasting contribution to the world is the direct product of his failures. Magna Carta only exists because he was bad enough to provoke it, and rich enough in enemies that they had to think about the problem in general terms rather than simply replacing him. It survived because he died at the right moment for it to survive, and because William Marshall was clever enough to hand it back to the people who had demanded it. Most of its clauses were repealed centuries ago. What remains on the English statute book today is a mere handful of provisions, including the one about the liberties of the Church, and the one about no free man being imprisoned except by lawful judgment. But that handful travelled. It went into the political vocabulary of the English-speaking world, into the arguments of the 17th century, into the American colonies, into the Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process, into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 4 original copies of the 1215 Charter survive, and people queue quietly to look at them in Salisbury, Lincoln, and the British Library. A tyrant who was not quite tyrannical enough to win, opposed by men who were not quite organised enough to replace him, produced a compromise document that neither side believed in and both immediately abandoned. And it became one of the foundation stones of the idea that power has limits. Nobody at Runnymede intended that, least of all the king. So let us close the ledger on him properly, and then let us wander a little further, because the night is long and there are other bad kings waiting. John was buried, as he asked, at Worcester Cathedral, in front of the high altar, between the shrines of 2 Anglo-Saxon saints. He seems to have believed with something like sincerity that their proximity might help him at the judgment. His effigy still lies there, carved in Purbeck marble, and it is the oldest royal effigy in England. In 1797 the tomb was opened, and the man inside was found to be about 5 feet 6, wrapped in the remains of a monk's cowl, which was a common enough burial practice for someone hoping to slip past the gate in borrowed clothes. His widow, Isabella of Angoulême, went home to France within a few years and married Hugh de Lusignan. Not the man she had originally been betrothed to, who had died, but his son, the one who had been engaged to her own daughter. She had 9 more children and spent the rest of her life causing the French crown a considerable amount of trouble, which suggests she had learned something from her first marriage. William Marshall died in 1219, still regent, and was buried in the Temple Church in London, where you can go and stand over him today. He had spent 70 years being the most reliable man in England, and his reward is that almost nobody remembers his name while everybody remembers John's. And the boy king, Henry III, reigned for 56 years, one of the longest reigns in English history. He was pious, artistic, and not especially good at ruling. He rebuilt Westminster Abbey into what you see today. He also managed to provoke his own baronial rebellion in the 1260s, in which the barons went considerably further than Runnymede and established, briefly, a form of parliament with elected representatives from the shires and towns. Which is worth noticing, because it means the argument John started did not end with him. It simply carried on down the generations, each round pushing the limits on royal power a little further, until eventually it produced something nobody in 1215 would have recognised or wanted. Now, having spent the evening asking whether John was the worst, let us be fair and consider the competition, because there is competition. There is Ethelred, called the Unready, which is a mistranslation that has done him no favours at all. The Old English is unrayed, meaning ill-counselled or badly advised, and it was a pun on his name Aethelred, which means noble counsel. So the joke is roughly noble counsel the no counsel, and it is the oldest surviving example of a king being roasted in his own language. He reigned for 37 years while Viking fleets took England apart, and his solution was to pay them to go away, which they did, until they came back the following spring with friends. The payments have their own name, Danegeld, and by the end of his reign the English were raising sums that dwarfed anything John ever extracted. He also ordered a massacre of Danish settlers in 1002, which was both atrocious and strategically catastrophic, since one of the dead was reportedly the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, who then spent a decade taking the country away from him. There is Edward II, who lost Scotland at Bannockburn, alienated his entire nobility through his devotion to a series of favourites. was deposed by his own wife and her lover, and died at Berkeley Castle in circumstances that later chroniclers described with a relish that has kept the story in circulation ever since. He is also, incidentally, the one whose reign gave England its first formal deposition of a monarch by parliamentary process, which is not nothing. There is Henry VI, who was pious, gentle, and probably the least suited human being ever placed on a throne. He inherited the crowns of both England and France as a baby, lost every inch of France except Calais, suffered a complete mental collapse for over a year, and presided over the descent of his kingdom into the Wars of the Roses. Nobody accuses him of cruelty. That is rather the problem. There is Richard II, deposed at 22. There is Richard III, whose 2 years on the throne generated more argument than most 50-year reigns. There is James II, who managed to lose 3 kingdoms in 3 years without much of a fight. And still, when the question is asked, it is John's name that arrives first. I think that is because the others failed in ways that are legible and almost sympathetic. Ethelred was overwhelmed. Henry VI was ill. Edward II was besotted. We understand those failures. They are the failures of people being crushed by something bigger than themselves. John's failure was different. He was not overwhelmed. He was not stupid. He was frequently the cleverest man in the room, and he used that cleverness relentlessly on the people who were supposed to be able to depend on him. And there is something about that, about intelligence turned inward on your own side, that people find harder to forgive than mere incompetence. Here is where I want to leave him, though, because I do not think the verdict should be a sneer. Picture the man in October 1216 at Newark in the storm. He is 49. He has lost the lands his father spent a lifetime assembling. He has lost the war he taxed a kingdom to fight. He has lost his treasure in a tidal marsh 2 days ago. Half his country is held by a French prince who has been proclaimed king in London. His half-brother has gone over to the enemy. His son is 9, and he dictates a will that asks his executors to make restitution to those he has injured. That line has been read as hypocrisy, and maybe it is. It has also been read as fear, a man making a last bargain with a god he has spent 17 years annoying. But there is a third reading, which is that somewhere in there was a man who knew exactly what he had done and how it had gone, and who at the very end could not think of anything to say except that it should be put right if anyone could manage it. He was born the 4th son with nothing coming to him, in a family where his father imprisoned his mother for 16 years, where every brother rebelled, where his own father cursed God from a saddle while running from his children. He was given an inheritance nobody could have held, at a moment when the rules of European power were changing under his feet, against the most patient opponent of the age. He was not equal to it. Very few people would have been. But the specific ways in which he was not equal to it, the suspicion, the vindictiveness, the inability to let anything go, the talent for turning a victory into a grudge, were his own, and they cost real people their lives. The judgment I would offer is the one the story keeps circling back to. He was not the worst king in the abstract. He was the worst possible king for that particular kingdom at that particular moment, and he was, in the end, the best king that a man like John could have been. And because he was, we got a piece of parchment in a meadow that outlived him by 8 centuries. That is the whole strange shape of it. History does not always reward the good. Sometimes it takes a failure, a grubby political compromise between a distrusted king and a group of angry landowners who mostly wanted their tax bills lowered, and it carries that document forward through 700 years of argument until it means something nobody who signed it intended. Nothing at Runnymede was noble. Everything that came from it was. So that is King John. Lackland, Softsward, the king whose name no successor would take, the man who lost an empire and accidentally gave the world a sentence about lawful judgment that people are still quoting in courtrooms today. If you are still awake, thank you for staying with him this long. If you are not, then he has done for you what he never managed to do for anyone in his own lifetime, which is to be genuinely useful. We will do this again. There are a great many more of them waiting. Ethelred and his silver, Edward and his favourites, Henry VI and the long slow dark of the Wars of the Roses, Charles I and the argument that ended with a king on a scaffold outside his own banqueting house, whole centuries of ambition and failure, all of it long finished, none of it able to trouble anyone now. That is the quiet comfort of history at this hour. It is over. Every one of them is dust in a cathedral floor somewhere. The empires they lost, the treasure that went into the marsh, the sieges that lasted all winter, the men who starved in cells at Corfu, all of it settled and done and beyond changing, and there is nothing at all you need to do about any of it tonight. If you enjoyed this, a like helps more people find these long, slow stories in the dark. If you have a monarch, a disaster, or a magnificent failure you would like to hear about, leave it in the comments, because a great many of these episodes have started life as somebody's late-night suggestion. And subscribe if you would like the next one to arrive quietly in your feed for the next time sleep is being difficult. No advertisements, no sudden loud noises, just a human voice and 800 years of other people's problems. Sleep well, history lovers. The kingdom is lost, the charter is sealed, the storm has passed over Newark, and everyone involved has been resting for a very long time. Good night.